My name is James Kicklighter. I'm a director and producer. I've done everything from documentary films like The Sound of Identity to feature films like Desires of the Heart and short films in between, such as Angel of Anywhere. And for Stage Play 2, we're starting this new program where I'm going to be speaking to you every month with different crew members from different aspects of projects I've worked on. And I'm hoping that this is going to be a helpful tool for anyone who's interested in being a director to better understand what it is that a director actually does. And so my first guest is going to be Jonathan Pope, who I've known since my second day of college at undergrad at Georgia Southern University. We were doing a fraternity rush and overheard that he wanted to be a director of photography, and he heard that I wanted to be a director, and we hit it off and have been friends ever since. He's shot everything I've ever directed except for two things because of scheduling conflicts over 17 years. So we have a really great working relationship, and he's done plenty of great work on his own, including getting his first Emmy nomination for The Social Dilemma on Netflix. So John, thank you for sitting down to chat today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, I know that people are always interested in different aspects of film and what they do, but how would you characterize the job of a director of photography? What is it that a DP does? Because I think sometimes that's mysterious to people starting out.
Yeah, the way that, I get this question a lot because, my husband is not in film. So a lot of his friends are also not in film. So I get the question a lot of what is a cinematographer, and the easiest way I know how to describe it is we collaborate with the director, and we are essentially in charge of the framing and the lighting and lens choices of a project, essentially the way that it is framed and lit, and that's heavily in collaboration with all departments, mainly the director and the art department led by the production designer. Yeah, and that's kind of the simple way that I've learned to describe it to people that may have no clue what that is.
That's a fair way of putting it. And as a director and a DP relationship, there are lots of ways that different people work. And one of the weird things about being the director, of course, is that you typically work with yourself. And so it's hard to know sometimes as a director what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, what you can improve on. Since you as a DP get to work with lots of different people, what is it that you find can be a common misconception about what that working relationship should look like, especially, again, for someone who might be starting out?
There's this misconception that you don't necessarily need to communicate with your crew, that a lot of it is on your shoulders as a director to kind of lead everything. And I think the more that you can understand that my position, the cinematographer, production designer, your editor, sound, everyone in every different department is there to support a single vision and to create the best piece of art that we possibly can. I think the more that you embrace that and understand that and communicate across departments, the more successful you'll be.
I would agree with that entirely. And one of the reasons I think we've had such a good working relationship in times when at least I've been most successful as a director is when you have a really clear vision of what it is you're going to do.
Totally.
I think most people, when they're starting out, don't realize that they need to communicate clearly to everyone on the team what it is we're making, right? And so I think when we were working on Sound of Identity, for example, I knew immediately, you knew immediately, we wanted that film to have an extremely cinematic look, even though it was a documentary. That was something that we came to the same conclusion on before we even started talking about it. And so once we started filming, we really communicated that clearly to everyone on the team, that this is going to have a very cinematic look. We're not going to be handheld. We're not going to do things gritty. We're going to really compose our shots. We're going to package this beautifully. And that extended to you and everyone else all the way down to composer when we were in post, to try to find a clear way of communicating. And so in my own experiences directing, at least, that has always been the clearest thing to do, by saying, these are the themes, these are the ideas, and this is what we're trying to accomplish.
Well, I think what you're getting at is actually something really valuable to mention. And I should have mentioned this before, jumping back to maybe where newer directors, even newer crew members I think sometimes don't understand the importance of pre-production, pre-production, right? Like if you can fix it in pre-production, do it there, or you can spot, challenges ahead of time that you can ready yourself for, ready, your crew for, do it there. Don't wait until you're on set because you'll have your own challenges on set. Try to set yourself up for success. So, with Sound of Identity, I think that's a great example of when you first got head up about the project and then you reached out to me. We had a pretty in-depth conversation about we kind of set ourselves up with guidelines of how we would approach certain things. We wanted the camera to be controlled as often as possible. We wanted to lean away from handheld when possible. Obviously, there are certain situations where you kind of have to break your own rules, and we certainly had to on a few occasions, just to be able to capture the moment, being that it's a documentary. But we set ourselves up with guidelines. So our pre-production for that was incredibly valuable, and how it ended up turning out the way it did.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting way of putting it when you're talking about preparing for films in general, that pre-production is obviously essential, clarifying that vision and setting the rules. And it doesn't matter, to my mind, if it's an ad or a documentary or a scripted film, setting the rules for the universe you're creating, whatever that may be, goes a long way to understanding what film you're going to make. And in many cases, as we all know from making films, sometimes the film you think you're going to make ends up being different than the one that you end up making. And that can also apply to all genres, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just they're different pieces of the process. We talk about writing a film in pre-production, production, and post-production. They're three different films. And so to my mind, you're trying to take pieces of all of them to create the same product you envisioned, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to start out the way you thought it would. And being flexible and malleable within the rules you've set to be able to get to that happy place of something you're proud of.
Totally. One of my professors at USC, his saying was, there's the film you write, the film you shoot, and the film you edit. And often those are three different films. And not in a bad way. That's just the nature of the creative process.
Yeah, and that's one reason why having trusted collaborators like yourself helps, because you're able to let go of things that you're attached to, or you're able to evolve your thinking. Because I think sometimes the most dangerous aspect of preparing a film and trying to figure out something is when you stick to it has to be only this, because then you're not rigid, you're too rigid, you're not malleable enough to say maybe there's a better idea and maybe there's a better way to do something. I think that there's a space where you're able to find that collaboration and find those better ideas while also sticking to the core idea that you started with.
Yeah, I mean, every production offer, and I'm kind of talking broadly, but every production, regardless of genre, regardless of whether or not it's a narrative feature or a doc or a commercial, whatever, everything offers unique challenges on the day that you're going to have to handle in some way. And that's more than likely going to force you to deviate from maybe something you had originally planned. And so that's why pre-production is a great way to set yourself up with kind of a roadmap for success. And if you on production find yourself veering too far off to one side, you always have that roadmap that you had set out for, to come back to as a kind of guiding principle.
Yeah. And that kind of leads into my next question, which is, what does a director need to do to prepare to work with a DP? And this is something that obviously I would think, as someone who, again, I only know our process, I don't know the process of other directors. We talk about shots, we talk about shot lists, we talk about looks of film, but how much do you think in your more successful collaborations the director needs to do to be ready to work with you in that pre-production process?
Yeah, I think that the most successful experiences that I've had have come when the director really had a clear vision. And maybe it's not even necessarily coming to me with a full vision of what that is. Maybe they're still trying to kind of talk that out and figure out what exactly that is. But you can tell, like, at their core, in telling the story, that they have a clear idea of something that they want to get at, whether that's visual or thematic. And then once that idea is there and that vision is there, then that can be disseminated to, me and our department and the different department heads, and we can kind of figure out how to bring that to life. That's essentially what we do. We bring the director's vision to life.
And so you're saying I don't have to have the answers to everything walking into it to be successful?
No, anecdotally, as a cinematographer, I hire my crew, right? I've got my assistant cameras, I've got my gaffer, my key grip, etc. I don't have to have all the answers either. Like, I hire people that I trust, that may have new ideas for, hey guys, director's kind of wanting this. I'm thinking we are going to do it this way, and my gaffer's like, well, we actually have this light. Why don't we try this one? And maybe that's a better idea. So you surround yourself with people that have their own wealth of knowledge and experience, and you lean on that. And if you trust them, then you listen, and you filter what's useful, and you best idea wins, I think, is often the way to go.
Outside of shot lists and things that are more tactical, something that often first-time directors kind of worry about, I find, is the technical knowledge of cinematography, having discussions about lenses and cameras and elements like that. In your purview, how much technical knowledge does a director need to have about some of those mechanics? Is it helpful that the director knows the lenses up and down? Is it something that the director needs to lean on you a little bit more? What do you find to be more helpful?
I do think that having a knowledge of what different focal lengths do and what they feel like, and how they how they can make a character feel isolated or really intimate in a space, is important. And oftentimes there's a lot of actors that I've worked with that know lenses, and they know what focal lengths do, and they'll actually ask the director typically first, what frame is this? What's my what is my frame? Where am I out of frame? Is this a close-up? Is this a medium? Is this a, ECU? And they'll kind of use that as a guiding principle for, to inform their performance and their actions. So I think it is important, not just in talking to your crew, but also to talent, because they will often ask.
Let's assume I don't know what a focal length is. Tell me what a focal length is, and what is a great way for me to find out what that looks like before I start working with you.
So there's actually a really great app called Artemis Pro, that many people use in pre-production and scouting. And in the app, you can go in and you can set up which camera you're using, which lens set you're using, and it will create guides, and show you what different focal lengths do, as far as the real estate of the frame goes. Essentially, a focal length is the millimeter of your lens. So if you think, the easiest way to think about it is a smaller number is a wider lens, meaning you'll see more of the world. So an 18 millimeter is typically going to be extremely wide. A 135 millimeter is going to be very, very, very close for a really intimate, close up or an insert. A lot of this stuff just comes through just working with it and getting a feel for what these things do. For instance, a close-up of an actor on a 135 or even 100 feels very different than a close-up on a 35 millimeter, where you get the camera really tied in. That has a different feeling, and it's something that's just kind of learned over time. You just understand how that affects you, and through even watching other films, you can kind of get an inherent, there's a way, getting in the weeds, but there's an inherent feeling that comes with, like, the proximity of your camera to your subject or your actor.
Which is why it's so important for the performer of any genre, again, to understand what's going on with that, right? Because if we get really close, then the movements I make are going to be very different than if I'm really wide. It's the same reason that people that perform on stage perform in a different way than they might on film, because you have to manipulate those movements a little bit smaller, because they read very or extreme close-up, which is something that I think you also have to learn as a director when you're working with these different or these different focal lengths, because then you're trying to figure out what is it that's going to communicate this and how does the actor understand that, so you can again convey the best emotion you can. That actually raises an interesting question, because you and I and everyone else that's been a director or DP sometimes deals with situations where you might have talent on camera that has a hard time modulating, right? You might have someone, as you say, that's going big. We obviously aren't going to name names or situations, but something happens. As a DP, how do you deal with that? As a director DP relationship, what is it you're going to do to try to fix it if it seems like the notes that are being given aren't being taken, right? Because that does happen occasionally.
It varies set to set depending on how involved I'm allowed to be with the actors. Sometimes, directors would like to be the only ones talking to the actors, so I take a very hands-off approach. And if I have a note or an idea that might help the situation, I'll go, directly to the director. I just have to feel that out. But more often than not, if I have something that might help the actor or an idea, I will, first approach the director, say, hey, do you mind if I step in, or I'll relay the idea to them first and kind of gauge that situation. I really try to protect the relationship between the directors and the talent and and the actors. So that I'm not saying anything out of the ordinary, but what I like to encourage is when we're getting into a scene, do a full blocking rehearsal. Let's make sure that our ideas for our camera setup still function with that blocking in that space. In an ideal world, you've already seen the space. Sometimes we don't have that luxury, especially in the indie world. But I like to encourage a full blocking rehearsal where everyone, all the people that need to be aware of the blocking are watching and aware. And the director is in there with the actors if they have very specific ideas, they're relaying that to the actor, or if they need to feel it out, that's happening there too. But it's in that time that you look at what you had originally planned and you say, okay, well, this still works. Maybe this doesn't work and I need to combine that here. Or this person's, turning away from camera and I'm only seeing their back. And maybe that's a good thing, or maybe I need to see the face. And if I need to see the face, okay, well, now I've got to add a camera. I've got to add an angle over here.
And the blocking is certainly very much on the director and, making sure that's clear to the camera team, making sure this is what we're going to block, because obviously something that you may not always think about is the choices I make as a director directly impacts the camera team. It affects lighting. If I'm going to have someone stand in one position and we get to set and find out we're going to do it another way, but now we've set up all of our lights for this person to be in this spot, I've just added another 30-40 minutes to the setup. On what it is, right?
Yeah. And I think that's actually getting back to your question about should a director have some technical knowledge. I think, back to reinforcing the idea that yes, the director should have some understanding of, lenses and of the way that light affects certain situations. They don't need to know it intimately, but I think having an understanding. So if you do want to make those pivots, you kind of understand the potential ramifications or the outcomes of the choices that you're making and those changes.
Which is important, because if I don't understand that I'm going to make this change, it's going to add another 30-45 minutes to our shooting day, that may mean that I have to take away something later. We might have to do overtime. That costs money. The producers get upset with me.
Yeah, you might have to compromise somewhere else if you really feel strongly about this one thing.
And so if I'm going to make a change on the day, I better have a damn good reason for doing it, because it's got to be something that my decisions are going to have a trickle impact on everyone else. And if I'm constantly making changes, as I've been on some sets in different producing roles where I've observed that, the crew doesn't get really thrilled about that if you keep making changes that are decisive to what you originally planned.
The best way to think about it for me is I generally, on a lighting perspective, I don't like, if I can do something, if I can create an effective look with a simple solution, I will often gravitate towards that solution. I like to say I don't like to be tripping over my own setups. And part of that is just because I find those large setups, if they're not called for, to just feel a little stressful and kind of, they feel messy to me when I feel like there's maybe a simpler solution. But another part of that is I like for the director and the actors to feel a sense of freedom in what they're able to do. Or if a director is if I'm working with the director and I think, okay, well, this one may, this one likes to change their mind or something, I might be a little, I might give a little more of, breath to the space so that they have the ability to pivot. But I don't want any director to ever feel like, they're showing up on the day and they're, just so locked in that they can't make any sort of creative pivots if they need to. Now, obviously, depending on the degree of the pivot, that could that could be a big thing, right? Like if it's a visual effect sequence and we've got all this previs and we have blue screen and stunts or whatever going on, that pivot could be a really big deal. Or if it's just a minor blocking change, where I actually think it'd be better for this person to not sit for this scene. Maybe it's more appropriate that they stand. Those sorts of things are easier to work around, and I like to leave room for the director to be able to find that.
Which you always do, and that has always been one of the reasons we work so well together. That leads me to another question, which is a more negative one, I guess. But in your most problematic collaborations, the things that have been least successful, have you thought about things, again, without naming names or productions, that might have gone differently if the relationship had developed in a different way between you and the director? What are some of the pitfalls that directors can avoid to avoid creating some of those problems on sets?
I think in those more challenging situations, what I have noticed is that it does come back around to pre-production and communication, and kind of leadership. To be honest, I've had situations where a scene is getting maybe emotionally challenging, or it's challenging from a blocking perspective, or we have something tricky happening with a location, and a lot of people are going to look to the director first. The director is going to be the one that people turn to for some sort of guidance on, how do we pivot? How do we adapt to this new situation? And I think in the more challenging situations that I've been in, the director doesn't really have
a solution.
They don't necessarily need to have
or ideas, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be one thing or the other, because I mean, I know in my own experience, improving as a director over the years, early on, if something went wrong, I may not know how to solve the problem, and then it's time, right? And then it creates problems for everyone else. But over time, you start to develop that toolkit of ideas, and you're able to pivot quickly to say, this thing's being held up, this person's not here, what can we do instead? Again, the leadership thing. I agree with you on that point for sure.
A director doesn't need to say, oh, well, this isn't working, we're gonna relight it this way, and that's the fix. Like, they don't need to know it on the solution on a technical level. I think what is often helpful is for a director to say, okay, well, this beat isn't working, or this location isn't working for this moment. And I know the core of what this scene is supposed to be from a narrative perspective. Can we translate that to a different blocking or something that would work in this space that's maybe not ideal? I think it's those sorts of things where a director makes that pivot, and then they lean on the rest of the team, myself included, to kind of help them make that pivot elegantly and as simply as possible.
Because as we said, I don't have to have the answers to everything. It's about having the team make that collective choice. Sometimes as a director, you might ultimately have to sign off on that decision. That's your job, but you make that with the help of the team and the people you trust. Because I don't have to have the answer to everything, but I do need to understand, again, the story I'm telling, how I'm telling it, why I'm telling it. And if we have to make that shift, that it's clear to everyone why we're making it, and leaning on everyone to have a collective answer that might get us to that better place.
And I'd say to that point too, I think as a director, not being afraid to speak up when something's not working. I've worked with directors that are very shy, and I've tried to encourage them, this is your story. Like, we're here to tell your story. This is your vision. We're here to help you. So if you see something, in the performance, or, in a wardrobe choice or something that's not working, speak up, right? Like, it's not helpful to anyone to get into post and then all of a sudden we hear, oh, well, I didn't like that costume choice or whatever.
It's
It's
too
like,
late. Yeah, it's too late.
why didn't you say that on
Yeah,
set? Like, we could
because
have fixed it then.
right, because unless you're doing some massively budgeted thing that's going to allow you to do reshoots, which most people are not, that
Mhm.
just you can't fix it in post. Like we
Right.
said earlier, you got to get it right the first time. And
Right. Just, again, communication, speak up. If you see something, say it. Just communication, communication, communication. I think it's kind of the thesis.
yes, I would agree. Communication is key, especially with your key collaborators, like your director of photography.